I get these questions, where do we start? So having a concrete plan is what you need before you go in and just start making habitat improvements. I've said this before, and it sounds really, really harsh, but it's the honest truth, which you'll get a lot of here at this channel. It's the honest truth. The thing that I touch on with a lot of folks throughout the year is I could just fix habitat problems, not stuff that was designed by somebody else or anything like that. Just fixing habitat disasters. Not focusing on correcting the habitat that hasn't been touched, but going in and fixing. I could have a full-time business just fixing tornado bedding areas that folks take a chainsaw in, and they you think that the more is better, and that's not the case. So we're going to break this down today, and we're going to talk about the top 3 worst first habitat improvements. The top 3 worst things you could do first. Kind of a tongue twister there. The top 3 worst first habitat improvements. So the number 1 is a lot of focus to a lot of people's agendas. Right out front, everybody wants to. It's food plot focus. The industry over the last 10 years has been so food plot driven by manufacturers that are selling a fancy bag, let's say, or the latest and greatest brassica blend, or whoever is selling it. I'm not picking on anybody at all. I'm just saying there's a lot of it out there, and the truth is, though, that some of these strategies that folks tell you that, hey, I'm doing this in the Midwest, well, those strategies won't work in the South. The stuff that's working in the South might not work here in my piece in central Kentucky. And the reason is the ground is such a playing factor in that. The density of the ground hasn't been this for years before. What are you adding to it? What are you trying to accomplish? Are all of your plots going to be grains, or are you going to be able to mix a grain and green in there like we recommend? So that's the first install of the food plots is probably the biggest and the most popular, I guess I could say, fail that a lot of folks do initially right off the bat. And why is that a bad thing? So it's a good thing that you're planting food plots. Like I've always told everybody, is I would never buy a property, a hunting property, that you cannot plant a private property that you cannot plant a food plot on, or you can't have some kind of a food strategy, whether that's through maybe that's through browse plots in conjunction with your food plots, or whatever that case is. I would never buy a piece that you couldn't go and put and promote some food plots. So that's the plus of it. The negative side of it is folks just blow food plots in wherever the God-given openings are, and it's I see, I'm going to be honest here with you, it's probably 5 out of 10 properties that I go on have food plots that were put in just the openings, and one are too far internal, and which is a loan and interior. So they're putting them in them openings just because they're openings, and that's where we need to plant, and it's easy. That's a great strategy as long as they're screened and as long as you can get past them. The only way that you can get away with a God-given opening and just go ahead and plant it, guys, is if it's in a corner of the property where you don't have to push in further than that. It's kind of an end point, and okay, if it's too close to if it's closer to the property line and you don't have to get around it, well, then there's something to be said for that, and we can probably keep it. So touching on that with my clients, is I always, I reach out and we talk about that, is okay, well, what are we going to do? Because I've got a bunch of food plots that are already planted, and yeah, you're right, I can't get around them. What's going to happen? Well, they're never going to go to waste. We're going to utilize them. We're going to try, do everything we can. We're going to dissect them, and we're going to see if we can plant that screen around them so we can get past them. If that's not the case, then they'll never. If they're too far interior, on the other hand, we're going to put them back into, we're going to make bedding pockets out of them. We're going to make switchgrass pockets out of them. We're going to, tip the trees into them to reclaim them into some bedding. We're going to, drop some spruce or some cedar in them, and we're going to reclaim them. So they're never going to go to waste. It's just a lot of work to fix if you go into this strategy, the worst first program here that we're talking about, the topic, and you blow a food plot in there first. If it's not in the right spot, you're going to have to fix it. And like I've always said in the past too, guys, is I'd rather see a property not put any food plots in than put them in the wrong spot. So the number two thing is, you're moving right along here, the number two thing is TSI and select cuts. The entire parcel. So what that is let's just use a 40 acres. 40s are notorious for it. I mean, there's, every property can have this done, but folks think that they are doing themselves a favor by reaching out to a logger and a forester and a logger combination, or if it's already enrolled in a state program, whatever the case is, and having that select cut to remove those large trees out of there, and before a consultant or myself gets there to help them design it. Because so 50% of that, if that happens, 50% of it is a design and is a fix, as a cleanup. So there's a lot of money that goes into cleaning that stuff up, where if you would have done that in reverse, had the design done first, and then you could have cut that TSI, you could have done the TSI or the timber stand improvement to fit the wildlife side of it, or the deer hunting side of it. So we would have done that same thing instead of select cutting the entire property from top to bottom and spreading your habitat across the entire 40 acres. We would have cut that in certain areas, and then you're hunting into edge instead of just, like I always, I refer to this with clients too, is if you're gonna select cut a 40 or an 80 from top to bottom and spread your habitat from the southernmost part to the northern tier, you might as well try to hang a tree stand in the middle of a cornfield, because that's exactly what you're hunting. You're hunting sporadic movement, and the only saving grace that you have is if your property has contour. If it doesn't, it's a horrible experience for folks. And what happens is you keep chasing it, because that is going to keep changing. Year 3 through 7, it becomes a huge food source. You're drawing in deer from all over, and there's no rhyme or reason. And then after that, what do you do? So I highly recommend doing the design first, and then cutting that property to the spec of the design, either that you implement from the learnings of the channel, or you have myself in and we design that, and then we can cut it so we know it's cut in the same spots, and then you can continue on with your TSI on the outer rim, and the interior is cut down, like we say. Anything in your core, if there's log value, we're going to go in and get that log value out initially. So you don't have to return into that for 20 years. You can hunt it the same way for 20 years. So that's a big one too. Number 3 here, see a lot of this is buck bedding creations. We're all the mentality of all deer hunters is focused around bucks. So what gets folks into trouble is they go in, and the first thing that they want to do is they want to create a place for bucks to be able to call that sanctuary. We're going to go into our 20 acres that we've never went into before out of 40, and we're going to go in there and make sure it's correct finally, and we're going to create a bunch of buck bedding habitat, and that's where we're going to start. And boy, the season's going to be fantastic. Well, what happens is they spend the time and do that. Not that it's in the wrong spot, not that it's the wrong thought process of trying to make security and make the perfect habitat for bucks to have side cover and browse. That's the plus side of it. The bad side of it is they haven't handled the food plot issue and sticking their does to that food source. So the does are going to find your first correct habitat from your food plot, and before you know it, they saturate all the way in there to those buck bedding areas that you've created, and now they're overrun by does, and the bucks don't have an opportunity to bed in there because it's drama filled and the does have taken it over. So don't start with your buck bedding. Start with your doe bedding on your food plots, not by just blowing the food plots in. Okay, if your food plots have to be there and we strategize and you know that your food plots are in the right place, then obviously put the plots in and then back them up with your doe bedding. Start with your doe bedding, not your buck bedding. One of the biggest things is, I just spoke to a client about this the other day, and we'll touch on this real quick, is one of the teachings that I do is, if you are talking about bedding, everybody who just starts talking about bedding this, bedding that, bedding this. Well, if you're not able to, when you're talking to the group that's helping you, or your family or yourself, and you're making notes, if you're not writing buck bedding or doe bedding when you're strategizing, you're missing out there. So start writing that down, start categorizing that, start splitting them apart, start separating that doe bedding from the buck bedding, and before you'll know it, all of a sudden your focus will be on what is doe bedding and what is buck bedding. Instead of just, you know, throwing a blanket over all bedding, make sure that you know the difference between doe bedding and buck bedding. It's no different than knowing the difference between an AM and a PM tree stand. It's very similar. You have to know the difference, and you have to know the reasons about both of them, and why they're good and why they're bad. So the you know, the creation, the access and the rut only stands. What I mean by that is they're going in to these buck bedding, the core, and they're making these. A lot of folks are making these buck bedding pockets, and we're focusing on how do we kill the bucks that are going to use them. So we're hanging tree stands in between those or on them, which is not recommended. Between them is better, obviously. You still have to get out when you go in and create that stuff, guys. Remember, you have to get in there, and you have to get out undetected. If you don't harvest, you still got to get out afterwards, even if you harvest. But you have to be able to you know, get in and out of that tree stand unscathed without getting busted, and that's where most folks start. Number 4 I see a lot of is the access and the access screening. For some reason, this started years ago, and folks think that if you put screening down, in other words, as far as hinge cutting trees along your access routes into your farm, anytime that you hinge cut anything, it should never be anywhere near where foot travel is, and that means getting to the stand on your access to and from your tree stands, and also on your access your furthest most point. So in other words, getting into that, you know, that final destination, that final drop into your stand. When you're in the stand, up the transition both ways, or out into buck bedding areas there, when we're teeing into that movement, none of that area there. That's why when I do a design, I put a huge caution area around some of them to you know, like a 50-yard, 75-yard circle, saying do not hinge cut anything in there, is because of that reason. We don't want any surprise bedding, especially buck bedding would be, you know, really bad, but we don't want any deer attempting to bed inside that area when we're trying to get in and out of those stands. And so that's the same theory. That's I see a lot of that. You know, we go to the property and it's like, look at all this stuff that I've screened here, and now they can't see me because I brought that lateral tree or that vertical tree, and we laid it, you know, lateral horizontal on the ground, and now it's blocking. I can't see them and they can't see me. Well, that's true. They probably can't see you if they were 100 yards in, but there's a potential that they're going to be in their bedding, and we do not want hinge cutting. We do not want edge feathering. Is a term that was started and kind of when we were talking about folks were edge feathering plots and trying to make soft edges. And edge feathering now, for some reason, and some properties has creeped out to our accesses. So make sure you're not getting caught in that trap, guys. Keep that edge feathering to the food plot. That's a huge one there. And the predator traps, guys, is just remember when you're doing all of this, if you know, relate to this, you watch this video and it's like, oh crap, I've done one of the worst first things I could possibly do here. Just remember, the pinnacle of all of this is do not make predator traps. If you can look at that and if you can physically see that something, your bedding areas are kind of the tornado effect, deer could get trapped. There's no open air, there's no open and exits into that area. You're not you know, focusing on what we talk about in our analysis packages, and also in the handbook. We're making doe bedding corridors that are 5 to 8 feet wide in those doe bedding areas, buck bedding areas especially as well. If those deer can't get out when predation comes in, we don't want that. And also the trap itself is, if you build these areas and you're tipping stumps over, let's say, instead of flush cutting stumps off, if you're taking your stumps out of a food plot and you're putting them around the edge of a food plot, not way off, or making certain or separate piles, if you're going to make a berm out of that, do not make the berm on the edge of the plot. And make sure that when you tip a tree over, you're not just leaving the stump uprooted, because what that is the coyotes, we've all seen it, the coyotes make them dens underneath that root mass, that root balls, and you're inviting predation to the plate, let's say. So these are the top 3 that I see time and time again across the country, guys. of the worst first ways to start habitat improving. So in other words, the moral of all 4 of these put together is have a plan, know the process that you're doing, and don't start by all 4 of these. Start by focusing your attention on your does. If your plots are already created and you can get around there, then put your focus, put your best foot forward first with your does. If you feel your does are handled, then you can move down through all of this on a checklist in the right order and make sure you're getting these done. But until that is handled, until that doe drama is handled, all of this is being done for none. And especially make sure these screenings aren't too far out there, your access, guys, and you're blowing the hunt before you even get in there. Thanks.